So today I'm just going to be going over my basic Milky Way editing workflow in Photoshop and Lightroom. And this will be a great video if you're a beginner and just kind of want to learn what to do to really make your Milky Way photos pop, or if you're kind of someone that has some experience but just wants to learn some of the basic tips and tricks to really make your night sky photos look great, realistic, and really give it that beautiful effect to show what it looked like in the moment. So the first thing you're going to do is import your Milky Way photo. Now I'm working with this photo right here, so I'll just go ahead and import it. So right now in the Library tab, we can just look through the photo. And I took this photo on ISO 2500, 18mm focal length, and then an aperture of 2.8. And the shutter speed here says 400 seconds. That's because I stacked this photo. It's a composite of 10 exposures. And this is something that we do to reduce noise in our photos. But really, if you're just working with one photo, the exact same tips apply, so need not to worry. Now, the very first thing we're going to talk about is the white balance, and this is really where a lot of beginners unfortunately make a lot of mistakes. So it's really important that we get the white balance right. Now, a general rule of thumb for the white balance, which is this slider right here, is that the sky should not have color in it. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of people, they will immediately go and crank these purples and crank the oranges and crank the blues, and you'll end up with a photo that's really blown out, and frankly, the sky is purple or the sky is green, and this is a really bad effect, and it kind of shows that you're a bit inexperienced, so this is not what you want. Generally, you want to work with a white balance that keeps your sky pretty muted, and a good rule of thumb to kind of work with is that orangish green transition from your horizon up to a darker bluish kind of sky. But you can see there's no real colors that pop out too much here, so I'm just going to leave this at 0, 0. If you see that your sky is too colorful, then you can adjust it one way or the other. The next thing we're going to do is the highlights. So I'm going to leave the exposure and the contrast where they are right now. This is basically because some of our other adjustments are going to affect those, so there's no reason for us to touch those right now. The first thing I do is drop the highlights. Usually drop them about 45 to 50. The reason we're going to do this is because when we raise our whites down here to bring out our stars, it's not going to blow out the photo. So generally, you want to be raising your whites about equal to where you're dropping your highlights. So I'm just going to go with 50, 45 here. And that looks pretty nice, and you can see just before and after, we've really increased our starlight in the photo. Now, the shadows we can leave. The blacks, if you'd like some more clarity or some more contrast, you can drop the blacks a little bit. And I'll probably drop them about -5. You really don't want to get too aggressive with this. And now that we've touched these, we can revisit our exposure and contrast. So overall, I think I want to up the contrast by about 8 to 12. This is a good number. If you increase your contrast too much, you begin to darken the sky a bit too much around the corners, and the photo doesn't look very even all around. And then for the exposure, as you can see, I could probably use a little bit more exposure in this photo. It's just a bit dark, but too much is going to blow out this section down here, so I'm going to do about 0.35 on the exposure. Now for clarity, dehaze, and texture, generally texture and dehaze you don't really want to touch. Too much dehaze, it kind of makes your photo look nasty. As you can see here, when I crank it all the way up, it makes a really bad gradient, and it introduces a ton of noise into our photo. So we want to generally use 2 to 5 dehaze. So I'll just put it at about 2 just to clear up some of the haze around this horizon. For clarity, this one's pretty controversial, but I'm a big fan of clarity. I think it looks good in Milky Way photos when used correctly. The problem is if we crank it up to something like 40 or 60 here, we can see this is just a little bit too much. It kind of introduces some noise and makes the photo look a bit over-edited. So I'm going to start with about 25, and then you can kind of see where your photo is. It's a little bit different in every picture, but I think 30 on this photo works. It's not introducing too much noise, and the photo still looks realistic. For saturation, because it's the nighttime and things are naturally desaturated, we can introduce a bit of saturation to bring back some of those oranges around our foreground. Now with the tone curve, there are different things you can do with the tone curve. You can raise your midtones here, or where you can kind of drop some of the blacks here to add some contrast. But I generally don't like to touch the tone curve. I think it just introduces a bit too much contrast, and I think we can already get enough of that right through here. So the next thing we want to talk about is sharpening, and it's really important that we get this right, because if we do it wrong, it's going to make our photo really grainy and gross, and our photo just won't look nice. So for sharpening, I go anywhere between 40 and 80, and you might think that's a really high number, but when we use masking, we can make sure that the sharpness doesn't introduce too much noise. So for example, we'll just hold the Alt key and just go ahead and mask out that sharpening so it's only working on the stars. And there, as you can see, it's done a really good job taking some of this blur and making our stars really, really sharp. And now you can see they've started to pop. The next thing is noise reduction. Now, I usually like to work anywhere between 20 and 35 in the noise reduction. And it's really important that we make sure that we reduce our color noise. So color noise is like those red and green and white pixels. And you might just want to bring your color slider up to between 20 and 25. This thing is contrast noise. We'll also bring this up right around 25. And you can see the before and after here. You see all that reddish and greenish pixels in there. Well, by using noise reduction, we've removed a lot of those. So I'm really happy with that. And it also helps to bring out some of that, remove some of that graininess, and so you're only seeing the brightest stars. And I think that looks really nice. So the next thing you're going to check is remove chromatic aberration. Now, chromatic aberration is kind of that purplish hue that can happen around your stars, and you really don't want that. I don't seem to have any in this photo, but I'm going to check it anyways. Now, you can do enable profile corrections if your lens is supported by Lightroom, and that'll just lighten up these edges, but we can also do that manually. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are these different adjustments and filters that we can use. So the first one is the graduated filter. I really like this because it allows me to fix some of the corners of my photos. Now, as you can see, when you're shooting on a fast aperture, the corners of your photos tend to get really, really dark. So what I like to do, take a graduated filter, up the exposure, and just move it up into the corners here and increase some of that exposure. So now that we've got that corner, we'll drag it around, flip it, and do this corner as well. And that really helps to kind of even out the tones of our photo and make it so that there's not this huge drop off into black in the corners, which is really important for making sure that your photos look high quality. And I'm just going to tone it down just a little bit. It's a little bit too bright there. So I'll just kind of reduce that a little bit. And yeah, that looks a lot better. So I'm pretty happy with that. And yeah, you can see kind of the before and after. It had these really dark corners. And now we've lightened them up and brought back some of the stars there. Now the next thing that we can do is our radial filter, and I like to use the radial filter on the Milky Way, so just ignore the effect right now, but we'll just kind of drag it out along our Milky Way here, make it a little bit skinnier, bring it down to just 0 on the exposure, and then hit invert so that it's working on the inside. So I like to up the exposure a little bit. This is where we can play with our white balance. I like to make the Milky Way a little bit more orange, a little bit more purple, so I'll go 2 and 2. I really like to bring out the whites. That'll kind of make the stars pop. Maybe drop the blacks a little bit. You can also play with the highlights and the contrast, but I'll just make some really minor adjustments right now with those. And saturation is another thing that you can bring out. It'll kind of bring out some of those purples and those oranges in the photo. So I'll keep that at about 10. And then we can add even more clarity. Now you have to be really careful. If you add too much, your Milky Way will look kind of blown out and unrealistic. So we'll just add about 5 or 6. Maybe I'll go with about 6 on the clarity there. And yeah, now our photo is starting to look really good. As you can see, here's the before and here's the after side by side. We've brought out a ton more stars. The Milky Way looks really good, and our foreground looks super nice. And overall, it still looks quite realistic, and it's still really true to how it was on that day. So the next thing I'm going to do is star reduction in Photoshop, and this is kind of one of those things that's really going to make your Milky Way pop. So I'm just going to right click, hit edit in, and hit open and hit edit in Adobe Photoshop 2021. We'll just hit edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. And this is the part where if you're working with a single exposure, you might want to stop. Star reduction can introduce grain and is a bit more of an advanced technique, but if you feel comfortable trying this out, it never hurts. And this is really what makes those professional Milky Way photos look so amazing. It's because they actually slightly reduce the number of stars in their image, and I'll show you how to do that here. So you're going to go to select color range, and then grab your highlights. Now, generally, you want to adjust your fuzziness and your range until you're working with a good selection of the Milky Way and its core. So I'm going to bring my fuzziness down and my selection to about 110 or 112, and you can see I've got a pretty good selection of the Milky Way core and some of the brightest stars. And then we're going to go to select, modify, expand. I'm going to expand this by 2 pixels. And then I'm going to go to select, modify, expand, and I'm seeing that I want a little bit more selection of the Milky Way, so I'm going to expand it by another pixel. Oops. I'm going to expand it by 1 more pixel here. And now I've got a pretty good selection. You just want to kind of gauge, you want to make sure that all your brightest stars are selected. So I might even expand it by 1 more pixel. And then we're going to go to select, modify, feather, 1 pixel. And now what we're going to go to is filter, other, and minimum. And you want your radius somewhere between 0.6 and 1. So if we go all the way up to something like 2.0, you'll see that it makes the image look really diseased, and we just don't want that. It'll remove way too many stars. So I like to start out with something like 0.6. And here, if we deselect things, see that 0.6 did a pretty good job in bringing out our Milky Way. And you can see this is kind of really what makes things pop, and it looks very, very professional. The only other thing I'd do in Photoshop is I'd grab our dodge tool, get a big brush size with 0% hardness, select your main color as white, and make sure your exposure is about 10%. I'm going to decrease this just a little bit. And you're just going to go through here and kind of brighten up the bright parts of the Milky Way a little bit. You can see this is just kind of making that gas and dust at the center pop and really making things look nice and bright. I'll add a little bit to the foreground here too, because that looks nice. And yeah, we'll just grab a couple more spots here on the Milky Way, and then we can grab our burn tool, which will darken things. Do this here, exposure pretty low, and we can just darken some of these middle spots that should be darker in the Milky Way. And I'll just go up the entire Milky Way and do that. And you can do this however much you want. I like to keep it pretty minimal. When I'm done, I'll hit File, Save. We can go back to Lightroom for our final adjustments. So now we can see our edited copy here in Lightroom. And you can see we've reduced our stars to bring out our Milky Way and make it look really professional. The last thing that I want to do is just up my whites and drop the highlights again. This really helps to bring out some of the stars. And here I'll just do it just a little bit. So you can see just that final adjustment brought out even more stars and really made the image pop. And yeah, this is all. So the last thing you're going to want to do is File, Export As. And you can export it as anything, but for me, because I want it to be really high quality, I'll probably export it as a TIFF. And here I've just exported it. But yeah, now we can view the full image here, and it looks really nice. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions about this process, go ahead and drop a comment, and I'll try and get back to you. But yeah, here is kind of my full Milky Way editing procedure, and you can see how from the before and after, it really brought out the Milky Way. Just looking one more time at the before and the after, I'm really happy with what we were able to do here, and you can see the picture on the right has really turned out really nice. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with another video another time. See ya.